New Testament, and that might be great for somebody who's studying or studying with somebody. So if you have an interest in that, maybe you can come up and ask Bobby about that. Now, Bobby's been married for 46 years to his wife Linda, who's sitting next to him down here, and they have 3 children and 6 grandchildren. So once I get out of the way, Bobby will be bringing his lesson on Esther. Thank you so much.
It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate summer series. It is a good time to deal with some other things that maybe we don't deal with in other sermons or Bible classes. I hope that I can see your screen back there, not without my glasses, maybe with my glasses. Just a few remarks if you want those files. There are files on those tracks on that other stuff. You can send me an email at bdgayton@gmail.com and I'll send them to you. They're free. The material is copyrighted. The tracks are not. Some of you have read my book, My Thorn in the Flesh, and I appreciate that. Appreciate the purchase of those books, and I hope that you read the book. Some have. Some told me they have, and I do appreciate that. Today I read, and it was a very sad thing, is that on one of the posts that I have on Facebook, one of the groups that I'm a member of is a veterans group, and there was an Iraqi veteran was told by the veterans hospital that they no longer had any room for any veterans, and so he was denied health care. Hopefully that'll be fixed by tomorrow. I hope, pray. There are those people here that I do know. I've known for a number of years. The Brooms actually supported Linda and I in the Memphis School of Preaching. I met them at Cartersville. And then also Sister Emery's here, and her husband, Brother Emery, was one of the elders at Forest Hill. And I've known them for a very, very long time. I don't know if I met them in 73, but I knew them. And also you have Sister Smith, and she's not here, I understand, but I also know her very well. And then I also know the Giffords. Okay, well, Brother Gifford and I go way back to when I moved to Conyers, and we met then, and then he worshiped with us in Cartersville before coming here. And Skip asked me tonight, why did we let him go? And I just pointed to Emery. But also I know Skip, and I was wondering what I was going to say, maybe to break the kind of ice, and I didn't want to tell anything on Mike, so I thought I'd tell it on Skip. When I moved to Conyers back in 1987, Skip was in charge of the building. And Conyers was the first congregation that I had ever been where they had elders and deacons, and they actually had deacons that would do their work, and they were very serious about their work. So I went into the bathroom one time and I flipped the lights on, and the light bulb was blown. So I proceeded, and I went and asked Shirley, the secretary, where are the light bulbs? She says downstairs. She told me where it was. So I go downstairs, and I pick up a light bulb, and I get a chair. I didn't know where the ladder was, so I get a chair. I climb up and put a light bulb in there and, went on about my business. Well, Wednesday night came, and Brother Skip says, did you put a light bulb in the men's bathroom? And I said, yes. He says, well, I count them light bulbs, and I knew that one was missing. And not only that, that's my responsibility. Don't you do it again. Well, he has a counterpart that he fished with named Jerry Gwill. Accidentally put some water in the baptistry, and that was his responsibility. And you can imagine what happened to me. I appreciated tonight when they gave me my lapel thing that they don't give Skip one of these, because we asked him to lead singing one time. He said everybody would leave. So, is that right? Did I tell that right? But it's good to see them also. Tonight we'll be studying from that of Esther, and I hope I can see your board back there. And this is 10 chapters, and I still got 40 minutes. So I don't want to speak too fast. I do talk very fast. But I want you to notice in Esther chapter 4 and verse 14 that the Bible there says, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shalt their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And probably that's the most verse used out of the book of Esther than any others that are there. But when you stop and think about this great book of Esther, we find that it's one of the most exciting books. I really got excited about the book. And especially when I began to, because years ago I was invited to the summer series, and I was actually assigned Esther. I didn't get to choose like I did this time. And not only was I assigned Esther, I was assigned Esther, a woman of action and modesty. And so I had to study from that standpoint. And this time I've had to study from a different standpoint. And I find that it's most exciting when you begin to read about this book and you read about Esther, but also that you begin to realize that the wise man Solomon had a lot to say about some of the things that we find within the book of Esther. That is, we look upon Esther, who she is, and the type of person that she is. And also we look upon the king and Mordecai and Haman. And we find that also the book of Proverbs actually helps us to understand about those characters, but especially that of Esther. And so we're going to look at some of that tonight as we go through this great book. But if you recall, the book is set during the period after the Babylonian exile, and in which the nation of Persia ruled Judah, and Esther is a young and beautiful Jewish girl. She's orphaned, but cared for by her cousin, who actually becomes like a father figure to her, Mordecai. The Jews dwell at the mercy of the Persian overlords, and it seems as if the scheme of salvation and the Jews' race had hanging precariously by a thread every moment in the book. The book's plot centers on the near extermination of the Jewish race. If that's the case, then according to Genesis 49 and verse 10, the bloodline of Christ would be destroyed. I want you to notice, and I thought this was so interesting when you, now you have to fix that one. I can move it, but I hit the wrong button. Y'all got a good tech man back there. He's working. There you go. There you go. I've already done. I don't know if you can see that, but that's actually Satan tries to destroy the seed. And we're talking about the seed in reference to that of Jesus the Christ, which would come into fullness of time, Galatians 4 and verse 4. He did that, if you were to remember, in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. Also, we find that God delivered Noah and the 8 people, including that of Noah and that of the ark. And so Satan was trying to destroy the seed. And also we would find in Genesis 12 and verse 3, the seed of Abraham, Exodus 1:6, the bondage and the slavery and the death of the males. Again, trying to wipe out the seed. Also, Exodus chapter 14 and verse 13, the Red Sea deliverance. Who was delivered? It was the Jewish people that was delivered. The seed was saved. Also, you remember that of the seed of David, 2 Samuel chapter 7. And Athaliah tries to kill the royal seed, and Joash is saved in 2 Kings chapter 11. And also, Esther chapter 3 and verse 13, that Haman seeks to do Satan's work to annihilate the Jewish race. Also, in Matthew 2:16, Herod attempts to kill baby Jesus. In Revelation chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, we would find always Satan failed in what he tried to do. But when you read the book of Esther, you find that here comes a time in the history of that of the seed, that here comes one of the closest times where there is a plan put in force by that of Haman, who is actually going to exterminate the Jewish people. He's got it all laid out. All it has to be is executed. And one Jewish girl, lady, beautiful lady, inside and out, stopped that. I want you to notice also there are some lessons from the book of Esther. It talks about that of obedience, and there's the passages that are there. And I'll go so fast that you won't be able to write them down, okay? And then there's providence, and providence is one of the greatest things that we can find within the book. Humility, faith, and courage, and evil of pride, and justice, and deliverance. We find all of these different lessons within this great book of Esther, and yet the main one that we want to see is that of Esther herself, the type of person that she was, and how that she worked in that of the very plan that God had to bring His Son to this earth and die so that you and I could have forgiveness of sin and the hope of life eternal. I want you to notice with me that this book is the most important book in Old Testament history. It's not a fictitious story, as some try to say. It relates to that of a moral point. It relates also to the events of how God spared the Jews. And the word Jew or Jews is found 52 times in this book. Interesting, I thought. And God's name is not mentioned in the book, but you go back to Esther chapter 4 there in verse 14. There shall rise to the Jews from another place? You may want to study on that on your own. Okay? In this book, we introduced to 5 people. Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, what do you say his name? Xerxes, I can't sometimes say those words. And so he was the king, and Vashti, which is a very beautiful woman also. She is also a very strong-minded, independent-thinking woman. But we would find that she was not afraid to go against the wishes of her husband, the king. And therefore, once she did that she was brave enough to do that, then she would no longer be that of the king, and therefore there'd be one who would take her place. Now there's Haman, who is the wicked officer. Esther chapter 3 and in verse 1, it tells us about him. And he was a wealthy person, influential officer, next to the highest position in the kingdom, in the court of the king. Now he's very wealthy, and therefore he's going to buy the great privilege of exterminating the Jews. Now, notice also Mordecai was a godly Jew. Esther chapter 2 there, verses 5 and 6. And we find that this book is slice of a history from that of the life of the Jews living in the exile. Look at chapter 2 there and down in verse 7. He says, and he brought up Hadassah, and that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took her for his own daughter. Now, when we look at her, and we look at that of Mordecai, the type of person that he was. And even, again, the wise man will tell us in the book of Proverbs the type of man really that Mordecai was. There is a beautiful message here for anyone who has ever experienced in that of brokenness, for anyone who has ever been crushed by life, or for anyone who has ever felt that his or her past is so discolored, so disjointed, so fractured that there is no way in the world that God can make reason and meaning out of it. You look at Esther. God can move the hearts. God's in charge of the world in which we live. God is not a slave to the human clock, as some people think. So this is a big picture that we need to see when we look upon that of the book of Esther, but also when we look at our own anxieties that we have in life. God is at work. You know that 4 years goes by from chapter 1 to chapter 2. If you were to read verses 1 through 12, and I don't have time to read all those verses, I'm just going to refer to the ones that I want to refer to. It takes an entire year for them to prepare these women. In other words, Vashti is no longer the queen, therefore they're going to have a pageant. Now, I don't know if they knew what a pageant was, but that's what I would call it. They're going to bring in all the women throughout all of the country that the king was over. Group of people, there was going to be one chosen to be the queen. Now we have to realize also that Mordecai nor Esther ever lets it be known in the first part of this that their background is Jewish. Okay? You have to remember that. This is not told in the first part of the book. We find that they would spend a year preparing these women, polishing up their outward appearance. She didn't need any. To enhance their physical beauty, and in a relatively short period of time, one's outer beauty can be enhanced, but the cultivation of the beauty that's within, there's no shortcut. And we'll find that in Esther. We find that when we look at Esther, and as we think about her in this environment, we remember Peter writes in 1 Peter 3 and verse 4, and he talks about that of a woman. He actually talks about the inner strength and that of the godly dignity that a woman is to have. There is a great need in our society for that of women and men who have the inner beauty that Esther exhibited. And so when we live in such a way that we adore the doctrine of Christ, Titus 2 and verse 10, we will possess that inner beauty of character. Now Esther, she exhibited, look at verse 9. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meant to give her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maidens unto the best place of the house of the women. So she exhibited a grace-filled charm of elegance, and she did not manifest a bad attitude. Also, we find down in verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Don't you tell them you're a Jew, what Mordecai had told her. Now, notice that. Mordecai acting like a father, she like a child. The wise man will tell us about that when we go and read from the book of Proverbs. Also, we find that she was teachable. Again, back to verse 10, but drop down to verse 20. It says, Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai like as when she was brought up with him. So she obeyed him just like Mordecai was her father. And so she was teachable. Also, she exhibited an unselfish modesty. Look at her again in verse 12 through verse 15. There the Bible points out to us and refers her, now when every maid turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months according to the manner of women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, to which 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women to the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came into the king no more, except the king delighted in her. Notice that. And that she was called by name, he says. In verse 15. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go into the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all of them that looked upon her. That is, we find that she comes to no temptation. There is no superficiality about her at all. There is no selfishness, no seduction or self-centeredness about Esther. She displays this unselfish modesty about her, even though she is a very beautiful woman on the outside, and yet we are going to see also on the inside. She was there for one reason. And that one reason is because she knew that the hand of God was on her life, and through that of the circumstances that she and Mordecai's wisdom, that she had been brought to this place for this reason, according to what we read in chapter 4 and verse 14. Esther is a model kind of wisdom, or a person being pleasant and delightful and attractive in a sweet and engaging way, regardless of all the surroundings that's there in her life. The time came for Ezra to go to the king, and yet she did not concern herself really with the outward appearance, as the others had. Instead, she just actually let the chamberlain do what he wanted to do. Her natural beauty, her natural grace was far deeper than the simple physical. The inner beauty of this lady immediately appealed to the king, and he made her his queen. So she becomes the queen. Esther displayed a humble respect for authority. Look at verse 18. Then the king made a great feast unto all the princes and the servants, even Esther's feast. Esther's feast. Esther's feast. He says, and he made a release to the prophets and gave gifts according to the state of the king. Those feasts were very important, and here this one is named for, or given in that for Esther herself. When we look at this, we find that Esther, in the book of Esther, God's people find themselves again in a foreign land. And yet we find not at home in their world. They're struggling to remain faithful to that of God under all this oppression and all the circumstances that are there. And God actually saves them this time by the work of this unseen and through this obedience and courage of a faithful Mordecai and Esther. If you were to go back to the book of Esther, it provides us actually with a commentary on wealth and selfish ambition. And it's this set of teaching that follows Esther in the Bible. We find that Esther is connected point between all we have seen in biblical narrative before it and the wise sayings that will come after it. God's people are struggling, and God is faithful to answer like all the other times before. God is going to answer, but in the process there is much to be learned. Much to be learned about wisdom and folly. If we take Esther and Mordecai as our examples in life, a close reading of the book will inspire us from the standpoint of economic, social, political, and relational privilege on behalf of those with less power. If Esther had used her place in the king's court for her own gain, she would not have risked everything to go illegally before the king on the behalf of her people. She would not have risked revealing her identity, but instead of seeking her own gain, Esther used everything at her disposal to do God's work. Everything. And so here we see her compassion. I want you to notice also, and again we've read some of those verses 5 through 18 of chapter 2, one of the key elements of the story is the fact that the people of Shushan did not know that they were Jews, that is, Mordecai and Esther were. The palace personnel found out about them in chapter 3 and verse 4, and also at the second banquet in chapter 7. And we find that Esther paints a similar picture of Mordecai and herself in this book as being the heroes. Not only did they find themselves in the right place at the right time, but they wisely, I underscore the word wisely, took advantage of opportunities of personal advancement. Chapter 2 introduces us to these characters and explains how they were in a strategy, whatever you want to call it. Say the word for me. Yeah, that's what it was. Sometimes my tongue doesn't work right. She had the strategy. She was put in that position to influence the very fate of the Jewish people. Chapter 2, verses 8 through 18 describes how Esther, the Jewish orphan, becomes Esther, the queen of Persia. She is identified by her full name there. Then we find that, if you want to look at the responsibility, Mordecai saves the king's life. How can this be? In chapter 2 there, verses 19 through 23, he comes along and he saves his life. In verse 19, he reminds us of the fact that Esther's ascendancy depended not on her beauty. She was a beautiful woman. I had some pictures of her, but I didn't think we'd show those. That people have paintings of her and things have come down throughout the years of people trying to paint her. But she was a very beautiful woman, but that was all on Mordecai, who gave her sage advice. Mordecai, a father to the daughter. Mordecai sat within the king's gate, and as sitting there, he heard a plot to kill the king. And so we find that Mordecai goes and he tells Esther, who tells the king in Mordecai's name. Isn't that wise? In Mordecai's name? If she was a selfish type person, Esther would go and says, look, I understand that. Someone is going to kill you. But she does it this way. I understand your life is being threatened. And I'm telling you this because of Mordecai. Mordecai has told me. And so this elevates Mordecai. Now the story is getting thicker, as we would say. What's going to happen to Mordecai? This was entered into the book of Chronicles. Why was it entered there? So it would not be forgotten. And it's going to play a very important role. But how important are the facts? And we will see that in chapter 6. It testifies to Mordecai's loyalty to the king, as well to that of Esther's loyalty to both the king and to her adopted father. This chapter 2 focuses upon a number of things. Hey, I can see. Hope y'all can see those. Wise children, well, let me go back. Children are to listen to their parents. Now, Mordecai is her adopted father. Mordecai is in charge. We've seen that by just reading the passage we read. Here the proverb writer says, my son, hear the instructions of thy father, and forsake the law of thy mother, for they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head and change about thy neck. Also, wise children obey their parents. So Proverbs 15, verse 5. A fool despiseth father's instruction, but he that regardeth reproof is prudent. Now you look at Esther. What is Mordecai telling her? What did she do? Did she listen to what Mordecai had to say? She listened to him as that of a father. Twice, she is told by Mordecai, don't you tell anybody you're a Jew. She kept silent. Now, I could make a joke and say that's hard for a woman. And y'all wouldn't laugh, see? You don't even smile. See? But she kept silent. She didn't tell anybody. Why? Because Mordecai told her not to. Twice he told her that. Now we find she not only obeyed the adoptive father, but also demonstrated one of the primary traits of wisdom. Wise women know when to keep quiet. A foolish woman is clamorous. She is simple and knoweth nothing. A talebearer revealeth secret, but he that is of a faithful spirit concealeth the matter. And also in chapter 12 there in verse 23, a prudent man concealeth knowledge, but the heart of the fools proclaim foolishness. And also chapter 13, verse 21, getting ahead of myself, evil pursues sinners, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. You turn and you look at Esther because she was willing to do everything that she possibly could. And as a wise person, she was told to be quiet, and she kept quiet. What would have happened if Esther says, well, I'm not going to listen to my father. I'm just going to go ahead and tell them that I'm a Jew. Esther was not only obedient and quiet, but she was loyal. While in that preparatory harem, she continued to be loyal to Mordecai and also to her Jewishness. Look at verse 10 there. This was another trait that was highly valued by the Jewish wisdom according to Proverbs 19:22. The desire of a man is his kindness, and a poor man is better than a liar. When Esther was crowned queen, she managed to remain loyal to Mordecai while also being loyal to the king. Two very opposites. We have to stop and think about that. Two opposites. Esther illustrates several wise maxims as an obedient child who listens to her father, as a prudent speaker who knows when to be silent, and one who remains loyal even in conflicting situations. It should also be noted that the king, who had been portrayed as a foolish king, because look what he did with Vashti, and who boasted and drank to the excess and to the very point that his emotions controlled his life when confronted by that of beauty and character of Esther even. The king is equally lavish in his responses. He honors Esther by throwing a party in her name, in her honor, by declaring even a national holiday, and by giving generous gifts. This too fits wisdom's image of the king. The king's wrath is as a roaring lion, but his favor is as dew upon the grass. You look at her enthusiasm. I got to get more enthused because I got 4 more pages of notes there. Mordecai defies Haman. In chapter 3 there, and just telling, we understand about Haman, and again, he's a very wealthy man. And he's actually a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag, which the story is found in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 8 through 13. The Agagite label distinguished Haman as an ancestral enemy of the Jews. He was an enemy. And so the king disregarded Haman's non-Persian status and promoted him to high position within his government as a, quote, prime minister. Furthermore, the king commanded that all of his servants were to bow down before Haman as a sign of honor. You get the picture? Haman, the Agagite, a hater of Jews. Mordecai, a Jew. The king says everyone has to bow before that of Haman. Mordecai, however, in verse 2 of chapter 3, would not bow or pay homage. This act was insubordination. Not only had Haman, but ultimately to the king, puzzled those who served alongside Mordecai, so they asked there in verse 3, why do you transgress the king's command? Verse 4 suggests that they asked this question not only to discover the reason for Mordecai's behavior, but also to encourage him to bow before that of Haman. But even though they spoke to him daily, he would not listen to them. A great lesson to learn. He did, however, explain his restraint by by confessing that he was a Jew. And he was not going to bow before that of Haman. So Haman becomes kind of angry in verses 5 through 7. And after hearing from the servants, Haman noticed this Mordecai not doing that, and he was filled with wrath, verse 5 says. So great was his anger, in fact, that he decided to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom, verse 6 says. Punishing Mordecai would not satisfy his anger. He was driven by a rage to seek revenge on behalf of all of the people of Mordecai, verse 6. And verse 7 explains to us how that Haman determined the date for the Jewish extermination. You read there verses 8 through 15, and here he is. I've got to persuade the king. I've got to do something to persuade the king, Haman is saying. So Haman is going to go to the king. And after plotting with his associate, he approaches the king with his plan. And yet verses 8 and 9 reflects that of Haman's ability to manipulate the king with deceit and bribery. Interesting. A slight exaggeration in verse 8. Their laws are different from other people. Or he tells them, hey, they do not do the king's law. In other words, it's not fitting for the king to let them remain because they don't do what you say. Verse 9, bribery, I'll pay you. Verses 10 and 11, so all the authority is given because silver has been offered. Verses 12 through 15 shows that the news of this plot spreads. The Jews were to be killed. Look at verse 13. And the letters were sent by the post into all the king's province to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children, women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. All Jews would be killed. If they were allowed to be killed, there would be no Messiah. The prophecies of the seed would be destroyed. The prophecy of Genesis 49 and verse 10 would be taken away because it could not be fulfilled. So here we have him. I want you to notice with me, and you see those, the 6 things doth the Lord hate. I want you to think about Haman. Yea, 7 is an abomination unto him, a proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devilishly wicked imagination, feet that be swift and run into mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren. Haman fits all of those. The wise man is correct. We find there a proud look, pride implied to his response to Mordecai, a lying tongue, a false witness who speaks lies. Haman lied to the king, verse 8. Hands that shed innocent blood. Haman intended to kill not only all the Jews, but specifically the little children and the women. The heart devises wicked plans. Haman plotted to destroy the Jews. Over in, I about did the wrong button again. Proverbs 29, verse 10, the bloodthirsty hate the upright, but the just seek his soul. Now that's Haman. That top part is the bloodthirsty. We find also, if you'll notice, in Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 22, an angry man stirreth up strife, and a furious man aboundeth in transgressions. In 29 and verse 11, a fool uttereth all his mind, but a wise man keepeth it until afterwards. When you turn to chapter 4, you find in response to Esther and Mordecai that here is that is plot. That Mordecai and the Jews in verses 1 through 3 begin to mourn because they heard all this is going to take place. And so they're mourning. Verses 4 through 17, Esther and Mordecai debate Esther's response. How are you going to respond to this, Esther? This was interesting. Here is an example of a father and her daughter. The book of Esther in the Old Testament describes this relationship. Haman, the story has told us, was elevated to that power by the king. He's issued this ruling. Therefore, everyone should bow before him. He gets angry because Mordecai won't do it. Esther, adopted father, therefore refuses to obey that order. In the fit of rage, he goes to the king and he offers actually the king probably a sum of something around $10 million in today's money. Esther had not seen the king for 30 days, verse 11 says. This tells us a lot about their marriage, their lack of involvement, their lack of commitment and trust. But not only that, this was not necessarily Esther's fault. At any rate, she was encouraged by Mordecai. Mordecai encouraged her and says, look, you go to the king on behalf of her people. However, to do this meant a possible death sentence. Look at verse 11, chapter 4, verse 11. Listen. There, if you'll notice, he says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's province do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court who is not called. See, she had to be called, but Mordecai is telling her, you go into the court. You go to the king. There is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter that he may live. But I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. If she goes in, she's dead. Mordecai says, you go in. Esther simply points out to us, if you drop down to verse 16, the latter part of that verse, says there, he says, I also and my maids will face likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. You talk about a risk in life. You talk about involvement. Esther had learned this kind of love from her adopted father, Mordecai. We as fathers, we are fathers, but maybe we have a better relationship to someone else besides that of our own child or children. Maybe we have related to a niece or a nephew or someone that's in the youth at the church as a father. But have we been a loving father, willing to trust, willing to accept risk, and willing to involve ourselves because of our love for our child? Esther and Mordecai They knew trust. They knew what it meant to be involved, and they knew what it meant to be committed, and they faced the risk. And the end of the story is they won. Esther's hesitation does not show her weaknesses in chapter 4 there in verse 11, but her faithful employment of that of the Jewish wisdom. Listen, the wise man was correct. Put not forth thyself in the presence of the king, and stand not in the place of great men, for better it is that it be said unto thee, Come up hither, that thou shouldest be put lower in the presence of the prince whom thy eyes have seen. Esther was a woman of great wisdom as we look upon her. Also, I want you to notice with me that Mordecai's warning, either go or you will be killed. She goes. I want to hurry through these because of my time. In Proverbs 16 in verses 4 and verse 9, the Lord hath made all things for himself, yea, even the wicked for the day of evil. A man's heart devises his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. You can see Mordecai's faith. If Esther fails, the enlargement of this place. We find the chapter reveals that Esther is both beautiful and as a jewel of gold in a swine's snout. So is fair women, which is without discretion. This was a beautiful woman, and she was wise. We find also in verse 17, it underlies her new strength. Now Mordecai did everything that he actually could do for her, and she went about doing all the things that Mordecai had told her to do. And whereas early he had commanded her, now she commands him. And earlier he obeys. Whereas he had been her counselor, chapter 2 and verse 10, and commander, verse 8, and advisor, verses 13 and 14. But beginning with verse 16, Mordecai takes his cues from the newly empowered Esther. It seems as if that things have changed. Chapter 5, Esther's favor and Haman's pride there. If you'll notice there, the wisdom of that of Esther in Proverbs 25 and verse 5, we've already pointed this out. One, by long forbearing is a prince persuading, a soft tongue breaketh his bone. When you read chapter 5 there, you notice there that she shows understanding of one of the Jewish wisdom's fundamental doctrines. You remember Ecclesiastes? Basically, because to every purpose there is a time and judgment. She understood that. She wasn't in a hurry. She kind of in some ways delayed things, but she was doing it in her space. She understood that God does not count time as we count time. She was a very wise person. That shows that of her wisdom. Even when Esther had secured the king's favor, she continued to communicate graciously, according to Proverbs 22 and verse 11. He that loveth pureness of heart for the grace of his lips, the king shall be his friend. She understood that. Haman also showed himself to be a fool by venting his anger. A fool uttereth all of his mind. Did not he utter all his mind? But a wise man keepeth it in it till afterwards. In chapter 3, there was a hint of his pride, and I'm not going to read all those. I'll just tell them to you. I know y'all writing them down quickly. Proverbs 16:12, or 26:12, Proverbs 16:5, verse 18. It reminds you of 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 7. Chapter 6, we find that the king has a sleepless night, and therefore, from this point onward, the events favor the Jews. But remember, this first began with Esther's willingness to appear before the king in chapter 4 and verse 16. Haman is forced to honor Mordecai, who is in the courts, verses 4 through 11 is asked. Haman came up with the intention of persuading the king to hang Mordecai. I get that. I'll get him. We'll stop this. This is what Haman is trying to get across. Verse 6 shows us prideful Haman could not fathom that the king would intend to honor anyone but himself. That is himself, Haman. Haman's request. Give him a robe that has been worn by you, king. This was a great honor to wear one of the king's robes. Let him ride one of the king's horses. Put a crown on his head. Haman thought himself to be the recipient of the king's esteem. In verse 10, the axe begins to fall on Haman's pride. The king took Haman's advice, but applied it in a way that horrified Haman. Now, not only would Mordecai escape from Haman's noose, but not only would Mordecai receive public adoration, not only would Mordecai receive what Haman had designed for himself, but Haman would be the one to proclaim Mordecai's greatness to the city. When you stop and look at that, and dramatically and ironically, if you want to say it that way, the tables had been turned on Haman. Completely a 360. who had no choice but to obey the king's command, and we can only begin to imagine how he felt. The shame as he paraded his arch enemy before the people. But in chapter 7, Esther defeats Haman. Now, there's Haman's downfall, his pride. It's predicted there, actually, in verses 12 through 14. Esther addresses the king with language that accomplished his sovereignty and his need for royal recognition. In verse 3 of chapter 7. In verse 4 there, the reason for her desperate request is to remember that the king sold them when he accepted money from Haman in exchange for permission to slaughter them. Chapter 3. Esther wisely omitted this detail. She doesn't give every detail that took place. She used what the royal decree said. In other words, if the offense against the Jews had only involved slavery, she would not have bothered the king. But when it was extermination, then something had to be done. So this revelation stirs up the king a little bit. He wanted to know who done this. Who done this vile deed? With whom dared to injure the king by killing his queen? So the text gives no indication that the king remembered having granted permission to Haman to do this. Esther says that it's Haman that is the wicked person of the murderous plot. The king's reaction and Haman's request for his life is found in verse 7. And in verse 8 we find that Haman adds insult to injury, therefore he's secured in his final deceit. You notice now who is in power. Esther is on the throne there. Esther is the queen. And look what Haman does. Haman finds himself in a compromised position with the queen. And the king comes in. Verses 9 and 10, here we have the great irony of the whole book. Haman died by hanging on the very gallows that he built for Mordecai. His terrifying death, shaped by the author of the book, also illustrates the conviction of the Jewish wisdom that those who do evil will be punished by the work at their own hands. Look at Proverbs 26:27. Whoso diggeth a pit shall fall therein, and he that rolleth a stone, it will return upon him. The robbery of the wicked shall destroy them, because they refuse to do judgment. You notice also Proverbs 11, verse 19, as righteousness tendeth to life, so he that pursueth evil pursueth it to his own death. Also, we would find chapter 12, verse 13, the wicked is snared by the transgression of his lips, but the just shall come out of trouble. Mordecai issues a new royal decree in its defense of that of the Jewish people in chapter 8. Esther appeals to the people. The new royal creed written by Mordecai is declared, and the Jewish people are vindicated. The idea is simply that the house once belonging to that of Haman was given now to Esther in chapter 8, verse 1. Esther, formerly under that of the Mordecai's sway, appointed him steward to that of the house. The king granted to Mordecai the authority to issue a decree to reverse the decree issued to that of Haman. Whereas citizens once bowed before Haman in chapter 8, they celebrated Mordecai's promotion. Verse 15. And finally, I thought this was interesting. Look at verse 17 of chapter 8. He says, in every providence and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness and feast and a good day. Now watch this. And many of the people of the land became Jews. Think about that. By the way that they had portrayed themselves in all of this that was going on to exterminate the Jewish people, those Gentile people turned and became Jewish people. Well, chapter 9, very quickly. I have 2 minutes. Oh, I'll go by y'all's clock. 5 minutes. That's what I said. Is that right back there? Everybody? Okay. The Jews defend themselves in chapter 9 there. When you look at all of this in chapter 9, you find that the theme of reversal continues there in that chapter as the Jews defeat their enemies. And with regard to the character development in the section, Mordecai actually grows in importance to such an extent that the Persian officials actually side with the Jews out of fear of him, verses 3 and 4. Either Esther is a careful strategist whose caution prohibits the killing of the Jews, or she is a vindictive avenger, is what some people say. But we find, in keeping with the wisdom theme, several proverbs suggest that if Esther was truly wise, she would not pursue revengeful beyond self-defense. I want you to read these and then we'll be through. The fear of a king is as the roaring of a lion. Whoso provoketh him to anger sinneth against his own soul. The wrath of a king is a message of death, but the wise man will pacify it. By long forbearance is a prince persuaded, and a soft tongue breaketh the bone. And also in Proverbs 17, verses, I got to go down through there. I'm going to go. I want to look at something else. There you go. Verses 21 22. If thy enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he be thirsty, give him water to drink. For thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head. Y'all know where that came from? It's in the New Testament too, right? And the Lord shall reward thee. Romans 12, 17 through 21. So we find that the book of Esther, with all of its peculiarities, including the establishment of Purim, leaves Christian readers unsettled, and perhaps that is why God included it within our canon. For it continually challenges us. It challenges us to consider our relationship to our world. A world of people that are loved by God in a world system that we are told not to love. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. John 3 and verse 16. John tells us in 1 John 2 and verse 15, love not the world. I thank you for your attention, and I hope and pray that maybe you'll go back and reread and restudy that of Esther. It is a great book to read and understand. Thank you, and may God bless.
Well, thank you, Brother Bobby, for bringing us a great lesson. So glad you chose Esther to bring to us tonight. Great example for us that we need to understand, through her life, what we need to do for God's will and His plan for us. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Bobby's going to have some surgery Monday. I'll mention that in our prayer. Ask for a blessing on that. Let's bow. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for all that you do for us, for being our Father, for giving us this avenue of prayer that we can come to you and seek your face. We thank you so much for all the blessings that you shower upon us. And tonight, the blessing of Bobby Gayton that you brought to us and his ability to study your word and bring us an awesome lesson of your servant Esther. We ask that you bless Bobby and his work that he's doing for you. And we ask you also that you would be with him as he has his surgery this coming week, and be with the doctors as they perform, that he be healed and come back to you, back to us in a full measure of health. Father, go with us as we leave here now, and we would remember what we've been studied here tonight, that we would take it to our heart and bring it to the world and do what we can to live for you and your will. It's through your Son that we pray these things, our great Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.